My name is Joe Mallahan. I'm running for mayor because I believe city government is broken. And when I say that, I really mean delivery of basic services. And we need a mayor that we can trust.
Are we caught in a time warp here? It sure feels like it. That was mayoral candidate Joe Mallahan from a primary debate in July of 2009. Thank you, Seattle Channel Archive. Is he going to dust off that speech and use it again 16 years later? I guess we'll have to see. He's running for mayor again, along with dozens of other political hopefuls following the May 10th registration deadline. Also in the news, police are looking for new ways to chase suspects without chasing them. More on that story. And a messy situation in the municipal court just got a little messier. All rise. Seattle News, Views and Brews, your coffee break political podcast is now in session. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine. And I'm with my co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, good to see you. I wanted to get your take on the Toronto Blue Jays versus Mariners series from this past weekend. It felt like to me, just in looking at what was going on, fewer Canadian fans showed up. But then again, the Mariners didn't really show up either. What did you see this past weekend?
Yeah, my memory is the Mariners have usually done very well against the Blue Jays when there are a lot of Canadian fans in town. So maybe that was their source of power. Maybe the fewer Canadians meant they played worse.
Yeah, reverse kryptonite or something going on there. I'm not quite sure, but getting swept was no good. So see if the M's can turn it around. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me here. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the podcast. Check them out on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to our show patrons. Brad just joined as a free member. Thank you, Brad. Here's the full deal here, buddy. If you want to sign on financially to get access to patrons first content before anyone else, that's what you should do. You'll end up getting a decal for your laptop. Ton of fun stuff here. We'll even answer your questions on the show. So take that next step up if you like to here. Patronage starts at just $5 a month. Very much appreciate the consideration. Check it out, Seattle News, Views and Brews on Patreon. Also, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, on Tuesday of this week, it begins a candidate forum in Seattle. Young Democrats up at UW. Thanks for the heads up on that Capitol Hill blog. And David, we do have a lot of candidates to consider here. Mayor, city attorney, 3 seats for the Seattle City Council, 5 races for the King County Council, County Executive 2. Which races are you paying most attention to?
Yeah, I mean, there's several orders, several ways of thinking about it. I mean, there's the significance of the position themselves. So, of course, mayor and county executive are I would say, are probably the 2 most significant jobs in our region. I think, in some ways, county executive is the most interesting because it's the first time in 16 years that Dow Constantine has not been on the ballot.
Right.
Probably 12 of that, you have to say he's basically the shoe-in to be elected. So this is the first time this race has been really open in a while, and it'll be kind of an interesting contest, I think, between colleagues in King County government, because you've got John Wilson, Claudia Balducci, and Gurmai Zahalai all in county government right now trying to take that job. They all work together, I think, friendly, but that'll be sort of an interesting competition. I will say, as far as like bellwether goes, and as far as sort of taking the temperature of where the city and the county are at right now, my money is kind of on the Sarah Nelson's race. I think she represents the shift in politics from the progressive city councils of the past the most. And, as the council president and as sort of the face of this quote, sort of moderate pendulum swing, I think that her success or failure will tell us a lot about how people are feeling about that direction. She faces a pretty well-respected and funded challenger in Dion Foster, so it's not like she can just waltz to re-election. I think it's going to probably attract the most money and sort of competition between various labor and business groups. And so I think that one will tell us the most about the state of politics in the area, even if it's not necessarily the most significant from a day-to-day operations standpoint as maybe mayor and county executive would be.
Yeah, great observation there. There's going to be a lot of different races out there to keep an eye on, but that one with Sarah Nelson is going to be one that we really should be keeping tabs on, especially. But I did want to take this next step here because you wrote about this with David Gutman and the Seattle Times. really portraying this as a time to either stay the course or consider a new direction in city county leadership, which the Sarah Nelson race will definitely have some thoughts on that as that unfolds here. Do you feel like any of the local political unrest over what's happening in Washington, D.C. will have an impact on these local races? Maybe that progressive backlash of some sort. Do you see that having an impact here?
I think it is having an impact on how candidates run their races. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what it'll mean for the voter turnout, but you see someone like Ann Davison who ran as a Republican for statewide office in 2020 for lieutenant governor, and some of the people out of the gate challenging her, Erica Evans, Rory O'Sullivan, and Nathan Roos,
Mm-hmm.
have sort of tried to use that. I mean, of course they would. Have tried to use that against them, and have sort of specifically pointed to, she's not the right person to stand up to Trump. The,
Sure.
the way she's running her campaign, though, she has, came out and talked about how she has a unit in the city attorney's office specifically to respond to Trump. She
Right.
joined the lawsuit over the, sanctuary city challenges, and she's
She started up this new drug diversion court thing, or she wants to do that
yeah,
too. Yeah.
exactly. And it feels pretty intentional. And I think that Trump certainly is factoring into that. And I think she's sort of trying to prove her, she really courted the endorsements of, say, Adam Smith
Mm-hmm.
and Gary Locke, two very prominent Democrats in the state. And so I think it has affected the race in that, in that one in particular, because it's really forcing her to kind of prove that she is the anti-Trump bulwark that I think a lot of Seattle voters might want.
Wow, that's going to be an interesting one too. Any other ones fit in the mix there that you're really keeping an eye on? I know there's those three council races up too. Any of those races there jumping out at you?
Yeah, I mean, the District 2 one is interesting because it's one of, I think, only two of the races that you mentioned that don't have an incumbent.
That's right.
So
Mark
that
Solomon is a caretaker. He's going to be stepping down in November. Right.
so that is the most wide open. It is a district seat. It is a district seat, so I would guess that it doesn't necessarily have quite the same level of pendulum swinging power as some of these other races, but it is open, so that's fascinating. And then I mean, we haven't really talked about the mayor's race.
Right.
I think that's because as things stand right now, Harrell is looking politically, on the surface at least, pretty strong.
Mm-hmm.
He has a lot of endorsements, some that he did not have in his last time. He's raised a lot of
Pramila
money.
Jayapal is a big one. Yeah. Keep going.
Pramila Jayapal, labor, we've talked about before, is much more
Yeah.
on his side. And I think, you talk to people, I think there was a general sense of, on both sides, like, hey, maybe he's good enough, um,
Okay.
and Katie Wilson is a very smart person. She's very influential in City Hall. She is running a pretty grassroots campaign. There
Right.
hasn't been a great example of that succeeding since you could argue Mike McGinn.
Mm,
But that kind of worked because Greg Nichols didn't make it through the general, and there's
primary.
just
Yeah.
not as much of a track record as of a grassroots campaign like Katie Wilson's being successful as there is a highly financed, highly establishment backed campaign. There are many more of those success stories than there are of grassroots success. So
Yeah.
I think it maybe is not getting as much attention because there's the feeling that it will be a very long shot for somebody to unseat Bruce Harrell.
Yeah.
I
It's
would have
very
said that
interesting.
about
Yeah.
I would have said that about Jenny Durkin. I would have said that about Ed
Mm,
Murray. Of course, neither of those people ended up becoming mayor for various reasons. So
yeah.
it's a long race. I don't want to count anything out. Things come up.
Sure.
But if the election were held today, I think Bruce Harrell is in a pretty good position.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And I have to say, the sitting council and mayor are plenty busy this week. That issue about speeding up light rail construction with some permitting help, that's in the land use committee for the council. There's a public hearing on the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy Tuesday night. The full council is voting on automated cameras. The mayor has an event in Chinatown ID as well. But you know what? We have covered all those issues on this podcast. So what is new? I know always people are looking for that. And I wanted to talk about this, David. It's called Star Chase. Love the name. Piece of technology the Public Safety Committee is talking about this week. I keep thinking of Spider-Man's spider tracers with these. It's kind of where cops are in a chase and shoot one of these at a car they're chasing. They would then be able to track a car in this situation without being involved in a high-speed chase, which sounds like a good thing because those chases can be dangerous. We've talked about that before. What do you make of this star chase technology that the council is looking at this week?
Yeah, I mean, my first question is how well does this work?
Yeah,
I've never seen one in action before, so I don't actually, I genuinely don't know if they work well or not. It
yeah,
strikes me as a bold proposition to shoot a GPS device onto another car and successfully have it stick. But what do I
yeah,
know? Maybe it works great. I think it kind of represents, I think it's kind of going to represent a clash of two eras in some ways.
mm,
There's the surveillance skeptical city hall, which I think
yes,
was really born out of the Edward Snowden era, 2010
sure,
and the years after. There was just a lot more conversation around surveillance than there maybe is today. And as a result, Seattle has a pretty strong surveillance ordinance. Anything that's perceived as surveillance technology has to go through a pretty long process. And so it's going through that right now. And I imagine that in that process, there will be some skeptical voices. The
yeah,
other era is maybe the more 2020 era where people were looking for ways to remove law enforcement presence from uh, unsafe situations for the people that they are pursuing and law
yeah,
enforcement themselves. And car patrols was a big part of that. The
hmm,
state passed laws limiting pursuits. There's a lot of data that when a cop chases someone at high speed, that often leads to pretty dangerous instances for bystanders and people who are not involved in the chase. On the other hand, we heard stories of police officers, um, having suspects flee more rapidly because they knew that they couldn't be chased. So I
yeah,
think this is
right,
sort of a response to that era, which is trying to cut down on unsafe actions by law enforcement. And so it'll be
yeah.
kind of interesting to see how those two eras of city government meet.
Great observation there. Just some background on this, folks. So this would be paid for through a $250,000 grant from the State Department of Commerce. 25 SPD vehicles would be equipped with these launchers. All the sworn SPD officers would be trained on them. And I should point out, I actually did some research on this, David. It turns out Oakland, California, in the Bay Area there, had these. They did not renew their contract last year with Star Chase after using them for 5 years. According to the Oakland PD, these devices have rarely been used. And when officers did try to use them and stick them onto suspects' cars, the trackers have either failed to attach or the people just yanked them off of there. So, in the course of 5 years, the department only used Star Chase 4 times and never successfully deployed a tracker to actually collect data. I think that's the
There you go.
biggest part for me. I want these things to crank out data, and even if you're getting some money from the State Department of Commerce to try this out or whatever else, I want something that's going to be efficacious and that you're not going to waste training time on, I guess, for the SPD.
Yeah, I hadn't heard or seen that. That's interesting. It doesn't surprise me. Again,
Yeah.
it's tasers often don't work, and that so
Mm,
anytime you've got projectiles sort of covering a distance and supposed to
yeah.
do something specific, there's a lot of room for error there. We see that with blast balls. We see that with
Mm,
tear gas. We see that with, like I said, tasers. There
yeah.
was a talk about these bolo wraps for a while that were
Yeah.
supposed to
Yeah.
kind of
Hmm.
wrap up people's feet. I think there are reports of those not working very well. So again, yeah, skeptical that you can successfully shoot a device and have it stick and do what it needs to do.
Huh.
Um, it feels like in the era of traffic cameras, that might be the better way of tracking
Yeah.
somebody. But you
Yeah.
know, and certainly there would need to be some accountability about how these things were used. You
Oh, yeah.
wouldn't want someone tracking their ex-wife or whatever it might be,
Yeah. Yeah.
there because which is a little bit of a joke, but there are also examples of police officers tapping into internal database to track to do personal
Yeah.
things, track
Oh,
people,
boy.
and so there, that is a real concern that for misuse of these kinds of things, that it
Yeah.
gives law enforcement an easy tracking method. So certainly, I
Yeah.
think these questions will come up in the hearings here.
Yeah, I would have to think so too. Thank you, David, for engaging on that. So much interesting tech stuff to talk about here. I just want my spider tracers and a good spider sense. I tell you, that's when it really works. All right, well, up next, how will a new electronic kiosk change your life in downtown Seattle and perhaps other neighborhoods too? We're punching some buttons, checking this out. Coming up next on Now Hear This. Well, unveiled late last week in a Seattle City Council meeting, a plan to build dozens of 8 foot tall digital kiosks across Seattle, a plan that's been around since before the pandemic. But now, as we get closer to the 2026 World Cup matches in Seattle, the conversation is getting a little bit more intense. The Downtown Seattle Association says these kiosks, privately owned and operated, could help people get around. They have a handy list of local events, and they could generate millions of dollars in ad revenue, as they have done in 20 other cities across the U.S.
Great urban places, great cities, great downtowns are places that are easy to navigate, to find your way and discover experiences. And this is a proven technology that's in place in more than 20 cities across the U.S. to help people do just that.
That's John Scholes, the CEO of the DSA, speaking there to the city council last week about this issue. David, you wrote about this for the Seattle Times. I think the pushback here is, do we want all these kiosks all over the landscape of the city? What's going on here? What's the back and forth we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two. I mean, there's three arguments in favor and two arguments against.
Okay.
uh, the three arguments in favor are they can sort of they have a public safety or a public service function. If there is an emergency, if there's something people need to know, they can flash this message. There is a kind of wayfinding tourist function. They can tell people about events happening. If you get lost, you can find restaurants. You can learn when your bus is coming. And then there is the revenue function, as you said. The advertisements on them bring money into the Downtown Seattle Association so that they can spend it on the betterment of downtown and eventually some other business areas like Ballard or Soto or some other areas around town. The arguments against are one, surveillance, again, as we're talking about privacy questions. Those were a little more intense early on in the process when when people thought that these would have security cameras attached into them.
Yeah.
They will not have those anymore.
Yeah, I heard that.
There are, at the same time, there's still questions about data collection, and they have some of them have a selfie app. So what do you do with that information?
Sure.
I would say the surveillance piece has sort of died down a little bit. Now it's really a design aesthetic piece, which is, do Seattleites? I mean, really, the question is about private advertising in the public right away, selling public space to private entities. And Seattle is pretty limited in what it does. It maybe doesn't always feel like that because you see private advertising on private spaces, but as far as putting advertising in the public right away, there's very little of that in Seattle that's intentional. Seattle has capped that pretty hard. And so this proposition is you're using public space, you're selling public space essentially. And maybe the money goes to something good, but you are selling that public space. And then, I think some people just don't like how they look. They're basically big. They're just basically 8 foot tall iPhones that you can play around on. And I think some people are concerned you're kind of taking the tech centric aesthetic that Seattle is already adopting that some people don't like and really putting it on steroids. The design commission, city's design commission actually voted against.
I was going to say there was a 5-4 vote that said no on this deal, right?
Yeah, there's a design commission that's tasked with sort of reviewing aesthetic designs to public space, and it was a tight vote. It was 5-4, but they did vote against it. They recommended against it. It's a non-binding vote. It is a recommendation. City council is free to ignore it, which they appear to be doing. But certainly there is some concern about how these will actually look.
Yeah. Where does it go from here? I know that vote, as you said, was non-binding, but it really looks like Council President Sarah Nelson is certainly a champion of these kiosks here. Where do you see this issue going over the next couple weeks and months?
I mean, in that first committee meeting, there was not a lot of, I didn't hear a lot of pushback. I really didn't know what the council I knew what Sarah Nelson thought about it. I didn't know what the council writ large thought about it. And I didn't hear a lot of argument against it. There were a few, notable people missing from that meeting, but there were 4 members on the committee, and they actually were doing some of the work on behalf of the kiosks, sort of explaining, these things are not what you think they are. They're going to be really helpful. So I sensed a positive feeling toward them. So I suppose if I had to bet, I would say they end up passing, and we end up getting these big kiosks around town.
Wow. That'll be really interesting to see. There's so many different things that are done in the name of World Cup improvements here.
Right.
I think we're going to see a lot of this over the next year or so, but certainly
Right.
something the council president is pushing for, and some good observations there. I haven't heard a lot of pushback from the other council members either. But I did want to continue with another instance, if I may, of the digital world crossing over into city policy this week. In the Housing and Human Services Committee, there's a discussion about Housing Connector, which, as the name would suggest, connects people in need of housing. It's a nonprofit run by Zillow out of Seattle. It helps people facing homelessness or housing insecurity connect with private property owners. So owners reduce screening criteria as needed to make units more accessible. This in exchange for service providers offering case management support for tenants up to a year. The basic idea is no units should sit vacant while people are out looking for a home, the company website says. While over 640,000 people experience homelessness in the U.S., there are 3.2 million units that sit vacant every day. The program has had some success around the country. It's in 6 major cities now around the U.S., has helped 9,400 people get into housing. I guess I look at this, David, and I'm interested to see where this goes or expands within the city of Seattle. But my take is, even if all the landlords in Seattle, let's say they open up their doors to the Housing Connector, I still don't feel like we'd have enough units for everybody who's trying to live here. What's your take on this whole Housing Connector thing?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about it. It's
Yeah,
new to me. I think it is, my sense is it's pursuing yeah, it's sort of pursuing this narrative about vacant buildings or vacant
yeah,
units,
yeah. Like
vacant housing sites.
gleaning those units that might be available in pockets around the city, let's say.
Yeah, and we hear this a lot. People throw out statistics about how many vacant units there are in the country, and
Yeah,
if we only put all the people who are living homeless in those
yeah,
units. It is, of course, always much more complicated than that. And a
yeah,
lot of the vacancies, when we talk about vacancies in Seattle, the vast majority of them are turnover from tenant to tenant. So somebody has moved out and somebody else hasn't moved in. These are not units that are sitting there unused for months and months or years. This is usually the process. I mean, what you need actually in a housing market, which is churn and some availability for when one person moves out. There's 5% of the units or whatever are open. That gives people some selection to find a new place to live.
right.
And so the prospect of sort of taking advantage of that inefficiency or whatever you want to call it
Mm,
always struck me as quite challenging. I don't know if there's more kind of nuance to this. I don't know. I think a lot of it would seem to depend on there being slack in the rental market that
yeah.
can be filled, even if it's not vacancies, just kind of
Mhm.
willingness by property owners to rent out.
Right.
I don't know what level of slack there is in the rental market right now.
Yeah.
And so, I think you hear about little tech techie solutions to
Solutions. Yeah.
challenging problems
Hmm.
that often, I'm going to be a little opinionated here right now, but often to my money sort of eclipse the larger issue,
Yeah.
which is need more housing, need more affordable housing.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not really going to solve that problem.
Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, it's an important discussion to have, and if there is a solution, I'm sure the council wants to listen to it. But I guess the other part for me too is like, all right, you get somebody into housing, and then it can't just. And I know that there's some support that goes on for a year, et cetera. But then what happens after that? Where are the
Yeah.
dollars to support? You know what I mean? Do you run through that line of thinking in your head too?
Yeah. No. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly my thought too. Like, is this in perpetuity or
Yeah,
do they get booted when somebody else wants to come in? I don't
mm,
know. I
yeah,
don't know how any of this works. And I'm sure we will get answers to that. I'm sure they've thought through this stuff. But
yeah,
again, Seattle is not 2009 Detroit.
yeah. Right.
There's, there's
Thank
not,
goodness. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Thank goodness. There are not the whole buildings sitting empty.
yeah,
If we want to talk about office space, maybe you could have a
yeah,
program like this for small
yeah.
companies or something like
Good
that.
point.
But um,
Right.
it's a different equation when you're talking about housing. So, how this works and housing, how much housing it actually leads to,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I think it's an important discussion to have. And if anything, it really underlines the fact that the Seattle City Council is looking for just about any solution it can when it comes to the different housing options that are out there or the lack thereof. So, an important discussion for the council and committee this week. We'll see what comes of it. Thanks for rolling through that with me there, David. All right, coming up next, a municipal court judge strikes back against City Attorney Ann Davison Legal case here with plenty of twists and turns coming up on What's Next. David, you wrote about this recently in the Seattle Times. A Seattle Municipal Court judge, Pooja Vadadi, has filed a formal complaint against Seattle City Attorney Ann Davison and her former criminal division head, Natalie Walton Anderson. Judge Vadadi says those two led a months-long campaign to exclude her from the court's misdemeanor criminal cases. I know there's a lot to this. Can you break down the backstory here and what's going on with this, David?
Yeah, so I mean, the city attorney's office did lead a campaign to exclude her from criminal cases. They essentially made it policy to have all of the frontline attorneys file affidavits of prejudice against Pooja Vadadi, which basically means, a lawyer in a criminal case has one slit that they can throw down to say, I want a different judge, and no questions asked, you get a new judge. Usually those are used in one-off reasons for whatever purpose, the frontline attorney thinks they can get a better outcome from a different judge. It's rare that it is a policy directed at a specific judge, as it is in this case. But that is what happened with Pooja Vadadi. And so she, a King County court actually concluded that this was a legal thing for the city attorney's office to do. There was a lawsuit from the ACLU of Washington saying that they couldn't do this, and they disagreed. The judge said, look, this is a tool that they're free to use. So that is all above board. What Vadadi is saying is that the reasoning that the city attorney's office put out there for why they were doing this was wrong and was incorrect and defamatory, basically. That it's not so much the action that they were taking, but which of course she was quite frustrated with,
naturally,
but more that in the course of explaining their action, they essentially defamed the judge by saying she was doing things that she said that she was not doing.
Okay.
And so that is where this formal bar complaint comes in. And I think that is significant because both of them are elected officials. We kind of forget that sometimes, that Seattle Municipal Court judges are elected by judges. And of course, so is Ann Davison. And so anytime you've got one elected official sort of formally filing a complaint against another, I think that is significant.
Yeah, elected by the public, both of them. And that's an important point of this. You mentioned this earlier. This was a complaint to the Bar Association, which I'm reading in your piece can hand out discipline ranging from some sort of admonition out there to an actual disbarment. Where does this go in terms of the legal process that's ahead for this?
Yeah, it's not a legal process. It's it's a investigatory. It's like a Office of Inspector General sort of thing.
I really wanted you to say quasi-legal, but keep going. Yes.
Quasi-legal. Yeah, maybe it is. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
And so, I mean, there's a disciplinary board that are made up of esteemed lawyers in the state, presumably, and they will look at the evidence and they'll make a recommendation. And, it's pretty regular. Actually, interestingly, and I sort of alluded to this in the piece, but I didn't go into as much detail. I think it was 2017 or 18, the Department of Public Defense, a lot of defense lawyers took a similar tactic against then Judge Ed McKenna. And in that case, he filed basically a complaint against himself with with the investigatory body, saying basically as a way, showing his confidence that he was behaving properly. There was a lot more nuance to it than that, but in that case, he actually saw it as a way to clear his name, do a full investigation, show that I'm actually doing a good job here. And he was right. He was proven right. The committee came out and said, he as a judge is doing his proper duty. And so, that's of course a little different. It's just sort of an interesting sidebar about that. But I mean, I don't know how long these things normally take, but there is some perhaps political consideration here that some of these, whatever their decision ends up being, will come out around the time of the election. I don't know.
Right.
We'll see if that has an effect.
Well, and the court stretched pretty thin too, right? I mean, they need all the judges they can get. Is that right?
Yeah, no, of course, and they have been stretched thin for a long time, and there's a sort of complicated restriction on their ability to bring in pro tem or temporary judges.
Yes,
they basically are not allowed to expand the size of the court beyond the number that they have, which is very rare. Most courts can supplement how many judges they have. So, they're already stretched thin for that reason. Vadadi goes down. Basically, she's only able to do traffic tickets, and that increases the workload on the rest of them. And so, I mean, it in that case made a sort of challenging situation in the court more challenging.
Yeah, there's a pragmatic side to it too. Thank you for that, David. It is time to wrap up, though. And I think I might ask you this question every year, but I need to ask it again because it is a discussion once again in the Callanan home. I really want to plant tomatoes. My wife says it's too early. Who is right? And more importantly, who is wrong? What do you got for me?
I have planted my tomatoes, but I've planted them under a plastic tunnel, so that's sort of they're sort of in
Nuance?
a
I don't
greenhouse.
want any nuance. Okay. All right. Keep going.
Okay, I'll say for my money, you can plant your tomatoes, but I would
Okay.
harden them off. So I would slowly introduce them to the outside before you plant them, so they don't get too sunburnt. But I think the nights are warm enough at this point that you should be okay.
Okay. I'm taking that as a passing grade on this one, but I'll have to see how that pans out. David, as always, I appreciate your advice on everything and all of your great input on the news that we're talking about for the week. Thanks to you. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you are not a patron, why don't you become one? Love to have you. Pledges start at just $5 a month on Patreon. That would be greatly, greatly appreciated. You can listen to us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Make that download happen. Thank you. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.